You know, when you watch a controlled demolition of a skyscraper, there is this expectation of just absolute precision.
Oh, yeah, completely.
Like, you've probably seen the videos online, right? The engineering teams, they spend months studying the blueprints, and they place these shaped charges on very specific load-bearing columns.
Right, and they hit the detonator, and the massive structure just sort of folds in on itself.
Exactly. It stays perfectly contained within its own footprint.
Yeah, it's entirely calculated. The dust settles, and what you are left with is an empty, level lot that is, completely ready for a brand new foundation.
But then you step into the world of regime change, specifically the dismantling of a deeply entrenched, multi-layered authoritarian state.
Right, which is a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. Suddenly, that detonator is wired to a million different, highly unpredictable variables. You aren't just bringing down an empty building. I mean, you are trying to demolish an occupied structure while the people inside are desperately trying to build a new one at the exact same time.
It's an absolute minefield.
It really is.
Which makes it a structural and political nightmare. You pull one support beam too quickly, or you sever the wrong electrical line, and the collateral damage could plunge the surrounding area into chaos for generations.
And that actually brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. So, welcome, by the way.
Glad to be here.
It is 2026, and Iran is standing at a historic, incredibly volatile crossroads. Today, we are exploring a really delicate, high-stakes process which is preventing authoritarian backsliding in post-transition Iran.
Yeah, it's a massive topic.
We are looking at how you tear down an authoritarian skyscraper without crushing the surrounding society. And I guess more importantly, how you ensure the new building doesn't just turn into a brand new prison.
It is arguably the defining geopolitical question of our time right now. And to understand how this works, we are looking at a massive spectrum of analysis today.
Right. What are we pulling from?
So we are pulling together comparative political theory, historical analyses of Iranian constitutionalism, which dates all the way back to the 1906 constitutional revolution, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And we're also looking at current geopolitical risk assessments and some incredibly detailed transition blueprints that were drafted by various exiled opposition groups.
Okay, before we go any further, I need to make something crystal clear to you listening. The blueprints and the analyses we are exploring today, they come from heavily politically charged factions.
Very charged.
We are talking about proposals from monarchists, Republicans, Federalists, and everything in between. Yeah. So we are absolutely not taking sides here.
No, not at all.
We are not endorsing any specific political outcome or any specific opposition faction. Our entire job today is simply to impartially unpack the proposed solutions and, of course, the fierce critiques of those solutions so you can understand the actual mechanics of what is being debated.
Because the overarching question driving all of these factions is surprisingly universal.
Which is?
Once a seemingly invincible authoritarian regime actually falls, how do you mathematically and structurally prevent the new system from simply, reverting to a dictatorship with a different flag?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before anyone can even draft a blueprint for a new democracy, we have to understand the specific, unique architecture of the current regime, the thing that makes it so stubbornly resistant to change.
Right.
Because I feel like outsiders frequently misunderstand the Islamic Republic.
Oh, constantly.
It is often painted as this purely personalist dictatorship, right?
Yeah.
People assume it's just a one-man show entirely dependent on the 86-year-old supreme leader, Ali Khamenei.
Yeah, and history shows us that personalist regimes, where power rests almost exclusively on the shoulders of a single dominant ruler, they often do collapse overnight when that specific leader dies or is overthrown.
Like Saddam Hussein's Iraq.
Exactly. Right? Or Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. Those are classic examples. The entire state apparatus was just an extension of their personality. But Iran operates on a fundamentally different model. Political scientists call it institutional layering.
I've always thought of institutional layering like a Jenga tower.
Okay, a Jenga tower.
But one where the middle blocks are literally glued together. Like, people look at the top block, the supreme leader, and think that pulling him out will cause the whole tower to instantly collapse.
Right, but it doesn't.
No, because authority in Iran is distributed across multiple overlapping bodies. You have the clerical institutions, the Guardian Council, which brutally vets candidates and reviews legislation, the Assembly of Experts, and these massive, deeply entrenched security organizations.
And those middle blocks are engineered to absorb massive shocks. They're designed to manage brutal elite competition behind closed doors. So if the guy at the top disappears, the system is structured to protect itself and just maintain the status quo.
So what happens now in 2026? Khamenei's health is fading, succession mechanisms are being openly tested, and his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, is rising in prominence. That seems to trigger a very specific, terrifying scenario for the transition.
Yeah, the phrase being used in geopolitical circles right now is Khameneism without Khamenei. Because the real danger in an Iranian transition isn't merely a return to a theocracy under a new cleric. The far more likely and dangerous threat is the emergence of a purely secular military dictatorship led by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
Meaning the institutions might just drop the religious pretense completely.
Exactly.
They just take off the clerical robes, put on military uniforms, and rule by the gun. I mean, it would look a lot less like a theocracy and a lot more like Egypt or Pakistan, where the military essentially operates as the state itself.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this layered architecture means regime change isn't just about removing a figurehead. It requires systematically dismantling an entire deeply rooted ecosystem. And the most formidable apex predator in that ecosystem is, without a doubt, the IRGC.
So dealing with the IRGC is the immediate, unavoidable hurdle for any transitional government. You simply cannot build a fragile, pluralistic democracy if a heavily armed, rogue military force is sitting in the corner watching you do it.
No, you can't.
But the IRGC isn't a standard standing army, are they?
Not at all. They operate on a doctrine known as Mission Command Mosaic.
Mission Command Mosaic, okay.
Yeah, and that doctrine is exactly what makes them so difficult to uproot. Think about a traditional army. It relies on a rigid, top-down chain of command. If you cut off the general's communications, the infantry battalions are paralyzed.
Right.
The Mission Command Mosaic doctrine turns that upside down.
So it is essentially a decentralized network masquerading as a formal military.
Yes.
So even if a transitional government takes over Tehran and completely severs central command, local IRGC commanders out in the provinces, they have the authority, the weapons caches, and the financial resources to keep fighting independently.
They can launch an immediate insurgency without waiting for orders from anyone. They're deeply embedded in local geography and local economies.
That is terrifying.
So a new, fragile interim government faces a monumental dilemma. How do you pacify a force that is basically designed to survive decapitation?
And one of the most prominent answers being debated right now is the emergency period booklet, right?
Yeah.
This was drafted by NUFDI, the National Union for Democracy in Iran, and supported by the exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. It lays out a highly specific 180-day stabilization plan.
And the approach it takes to the IRGC is incredibly controversial, precisely because of how pragmatic it is.
Right, because the blueprint essentially suggests categorizing the IRGC forces into three distinct buckets.
Exactly.
First, you retain the technical mid-level professionals.
Yes.
So the people running the radar systems and logistics. You keep them to prevent a total national security vacuum.
Yeah.
Second, you retain but retrain the basic collaborators, like low-level administrators and conscripts. And third, you aggressively prosecute the criminal perpetrators, meaning the senior commanders with actual blood on their hands.
But the criticism of this approach is severe. Detractors warn that integrating any former IRGC specialist prioritizes technocratic stability over transitional justice.
Which is a huge debate.
The fear is that keeping the logistical and intelligence operators in place is basically a recipe for recreating old, abusive power networks.
I have to admit, that criticism makes total sense to me.
Yeah.
I mean, if your goal is to dismantle an authoritarian skyscraper, leaving elements of the primary repressive force intact seems like immediately sabotaging your own fragile democracy.
Right.
You are basically hiring the architects of the prison to build the new school.
It is an agonizing tension, but the analysts advocating for this tiered approach, they are pointing directly to the brutal, catastrophic lessons of recent history. They are looking squarely at the de-Baathification of Iraq back in 2003.
Oh, right. When the U.S. coalition issued those early orders that essentially fired the entire Iraqi military and the Ba'ath Party bureaucracy overnight,
Yeah.
They just erased them from the payroll.
The coalition prioritized absolute transitional justice and ideological purity. They wanted a completely clean slate.
Yeah.
But the physical result of that policy was creating a demographic of hundreds of thousands of unemployed, highly trained men who still had their weapons. It immediately fueled a devastating decade-long insurgency. So the experts warning against a total, uncompromising purge of the IRGC, they're trying to avoid that exact disaster.
So you are balancing the moral demand for justice for the victims of the regime against the cold mathematical need to prevent a full-blown civil war.
Exactly.
Because if you corner a massive organization like the IRGC and give them absolutely no way out and no financial future, they will fight to the death and tear the country apart in the process.
Transitional governments operate in a world of terrible trade-offs. You have to somehow defang the organization without triggering a massive armed blowback.
But, taking away their military command structure doesn't solve the fact that they literally own the country's checkbook.
No, it doesn't.
You cannot dismantle a military's political power without also dismantling the wallet that funds it. The IRGC's power isn't just measured in ballistic missiles, is it?
No.
It is measured in real estate, shipping lanes, and corporate monopolies.
The Islamic Republic functions as a subcontractor state. The numbers are just staggering. Economists estimate that roughly 60% of the entire Iranian economy is controlled by IRGC-affiliated organizations.
60%.
Yeah, and by massive, tax-exempt religious foundations known as bonyads.
Okay, so what does this all mean for the listener? It means the bonyads operate like an unaccountable shadow corporation that essentially owns the state apparatus.
Right.
We aren't just talking about a few factories here. They control the major ports, the telecommunications grids, massive construction conglomerates, and oil export networks.
It's everything.
So you can't just install a new democratic president at the top. You have to break up the economic monopoly. Otherwise, that new president is just going to be a hostage to whoever controls the ports.
And the economic exhaustion caused by this cartel system is catastrophic. By late 2025, the dirham plummeted from 1.07 million to 1.4 million per US dollar in a matter of weeks.
That is insane.
We are looking at inflation persistently exceeding 60%. The purchasing power of the average Iranian citizen has been entirely obliterated.
Because the economy isn't designed to generate wealth for the public, right?
Exactly. It's designed to funnel resources into the security apparatus.
Which means a post-transition Iran requires a massive decartelization effort. They have to strategically and pluralistically reintegrate into the global economy. And critically, they have to step away from the resource curse of oil dependency.
The resource curse is a foundational pillar of authoritarianism, because without tackling the military boneyard complex and the state's reliance on oil revenue, any new political elite, even ones with the best democratic intentions, they will face a massive temptation.
Because if the state doesn't need to tax its citizens to survive, it doesn't need to listen to them either.
Right.
If you just pull billions of dollars out of the ground by selling oil, you can fund your security forces and your bureaucracy without ever asking the public for a single dime. It completely severs the link between taxation and political representation.
Which is why transitioning toward a clean energy economy or drastically diversifying the industrial base away from a hydrocarbon monopoly is treated in these blueprints not just as an environmental goal.
It's a survival tactic.
It is a structural democratic necessity. It permanently strips away the unearned financial leverage that has historically insulated Iranian rulers from public accountability.
Okay, so a transitional government manages to vet the military without sparking an insurgency, and they begin breaking up the massive shadow economy.
Right.
Once you take back that national checkbook, you hit another monumental hurdle, deciding who actually gets to spend that money locally.
Oh, yeah.
And here is where it gets really interesting. Because Iran is a vast, ethnically and linguistically diverse nation. So how do you distribute political power across that geography without fracturing the country into a dozen pieces?
You are stepping right into the federalism debate. It is easily one of the most volatile and contentious issues in all of the post-transition planning.
The polarization is wild. On one side, you have groups like the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, the KDPI, and Komala. They strongly advocate for ethnic federalism.
Yes.
And their argument is rooted in decades of trauma.
Yeah.
After a century of heavily centralized suppression from Tehran, they argue the only way to genuinely protect minority rights, preserve local languages, and ensure cultural autonomy is to draw hard federal lines that give specific ethnic groups control over their own territories.
But then you look at the blistering critiques of that exact model. The response to the FDD and NUFDI blueprints, which critics sometimes derisively label the Iranistan project, argues that ethnic federalism is essentially an imported imperial script.
Right.
They say it is designed to permanently balkanize and weaken Iranian sovereignty.
The critics view ethnic federalism less as a mechanism for minority representation and more like, drawing perforated lines across the map, just waiting for the whole country to be torn apart into competing ethno-states.
This raises a really important question about definitions, because the debates often get bogged down when people confuse two very different concepts.
Which are?
There is a massive operational difference between administrative decentralization and ethnic federalism.
Right. So you're saying administrative decentralization is really about utility and efficiency.
Exactly.
It means giving a local province the authority to manage its own power grid, fix its own potholes, and allocate its own local education budget. It brings the boring, day-to-day mechanisms of governance closer to the actual citizens, regardless of who lives in that province.
Yes, administrative decentralization is geographically based. Ethnic federalism, on the other hand, ties territory and political power directly to a specific ethno-linguistic identity.
Okay.
It declares a certain region as inherently belonging to a specific ethnic group.
This province is the Kurdish state, this province is the Baluch state.
Right. Yeah.
It codifies identity into the actual borders.
And critics of ethnic federalism point directly to modern comparative examples, specifically Iraq and the former Yugoslavia.
Which did not go well.
No. Organizing a fragile, post-authoritarian state primarily by ethnic identity didn't resolve historical tensions. It paralyzed the central government and locked local communities into permanent, zero-sum rivalries. The argument is that you can have robust decentralization that legally guarantees linguistic and cultural rights across the entire country without carving the physical map into competing ethnic enclaves.
So to navigate these massive existential landmines, the decentralized IRGC insurgency, a monopolized economy, and deep ethnic divisions, a post-transition, Iran needs an incredibly resilient constitutional design.
Absolutely.
It needs ironclad legal guardrails to prevent the entire project from sliding right back into autocracy.
A well-crafted constitution is the first and often the most critical line of defense during a fragile transition.
And there is a fascinating, fierce debate right now about the very nature of that future state. You have the Conservative Party of Iran proposing a constitutional monarchy, leaning heavily on the historical continuity and symbolic unity of the Pahlavi dynasty. And on the other side, massive coalitions are demanding a strictly secular republic. But what stands out to me is a remarkable level of political maturity.
How so?
Both sides almost universally agree on the mechanism to decide this. They agree there must be a free, internationally monitored national referendum for the Iranian people to ultimately decide the system.
Which is huge, because beyond the symbolic label of republic or monarchy, the mathematical institutional design is what actually determines a democracy's survival.
Right.
Comparative political studies consistently show that parliamentary systems generally encourage democratic deliberation. They force different factions to build coalitions and compromise to form a government.
Whereas a presidential system,
Conversely, personalist presidential systems, where a single president is elected with massive centralized executive power, they are statistically much more vulnerable to strongman takeovers.
the math makes sense. I mean, if you build a system where all the meaningful power sits in one executive chair, a charismatic populace just has to win one election and sit in it.
Exactly.
But in a parliamentary system, power is diffused across the legislature.
Which is why judicial independence is the other non-negotiable pillar here. The blueprints propose establishing a transitional divan during the immediate emergency period, which would eventually evolve into a permanent, highly powerful constitutional court.
Okay.
You need a judiciary that has the legal teeth to unilaterally block unconstitutional actions by the executive and the structural funding to remain completely immune to political interference or blackmail.
But let's look at the actual mechanics of the transition phase itself. We have seen this play out tragically so many times in history. Someone steps up, forms a steering committee, and says, I am just here as a transitional leader to guide us safely to democratic elections.
Yeah, we all know how that ends.
Right. 10 years later, they are still in power and the elections are permanently delayed. So how do you prevent the interim government from becoming the new permanent dictatorship?
That is the ultimate stress test of the emergency phase. And to preempt that, various opposition coalitions, like the Iran Freedom Congress, have adopted frameworks they call minimum common principle.
What does that entail?
The core philosophy is that interim leaders must be legally constrained by multiple overlapping veto points. You cannot have a single transitional council writing all the rules in a vacuum. You need strict civilian oversight over whatever interim security forces exist.
And critically, you need a robust, digitally connected civil society acting as the ultimate unforgiving watchdog.
The digital public square.
Yes.
Civil society organizations, independent journalists, labor unions, and student groups, they have to be empowered to call out the interim government the absolute second they start backtracking.
Right.
And this has to happen long before the permanent institutions like a constitutional court are even built. If an interim steering committee tries to quietly censor a newspaper or indefinitely delay the referendum, the digital public square has to light up and mobilize instantly.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's sort of summarize the incredible tightrope walk of an Iranian transition.
It is a lot.
You have a nation that must delicately vet and neutralize a massive, deeply embedded military apparatus without starting a civil war.
Right.
You have to meticulously decouple a monopolized shadow economy from the military's grip without crashing the supply chains. You have to balance rich ethnic diversity with administrative efficiency without fracturing the nation's sovereignty. And you have to engineer a constitution that can mathematically outsmart future autocrats.
It is a staggering, monumental task, but the detailed blueprints do exist. The brutal historical lessons from neighboring countries have been meticulously documented, and the conversations happening among political theorists and opposition groups right now in 2026 are deeply pragmatic.
Yeah.
It is no longer a conversation just about revolutionary slogans. It is about the cold, hard mechanics of governance.
But before we go, I want to leave you listening with a final thought to mull over. We have spent this entire deep dive talking about blueprints, institutional structures, and constitutional rules.
Right.
But imagine this scenario. What if a post-transition Iran successfully builds all of these things? They create a powerful, independent constitutional court, a highly efficient, decentralized bureaucracy, and a flourishing digital public square.
Okay.
What happens if a brilliant, charismatic populist manages to hijack the system anyway? Are perfectly designed institutions ever truly enough to prevent authoritarian backsliding? Or does democratic resilience ultimately depend on a culture, a population, that is willing to bleed to defend those rules when someone inevitably tries to break them?
That's the real question. You can build the most structurally sound, perfectly engineered skyscraper in the world, but its survival ultimately relies on the vigilance of the people living inside it to maintain the foundation.
We started today by talking about a controlled demolition. There is always an explosive, satisfying moment when the old, corrupted structure finally falls. But the truth is, tearing down the authoritarian skyscraper is actually the easy part.
Yeah.
The real test is the morning after the dust settles. You have to look at the empty lot, pick up a shovel, and figure out how to agree with your neighbors on what to build next. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.